Welcome, everyone. Today we are talking about this blog post, The Psychology of Memorialization, Why We Need Physical Markers.
hmm
And, it's something that's been on my mind a lot lately, especially after going through the process of choosing a headstone for my dad.
Oh,
He was an avid sailor, absolutely loved the ocean.
okay.
So we ended up choosing a beautiful granite headstone with a lighthouse engraved on it.
Wow.
It felt so right,
Yeah.
like a perfect symbol of his spirit.
It's interesting how certain objects can evoke such powerful memories and emotions. Choosing a memorial for a loved one is such a personal and meaningful experience. And this article really delves into the psychology behind why we feel this innate need to create these physical markers.
It does, and it brought up a lot of thoughts for me, like why a simple headstone could feel so comforting. The article mentions that these memorials can serve as dedicated spaces for remembrance and reflection. What exactly does that mean in a practical sense?
Well, think of it this way. A memorial provides a tangible focal point for our memories and emotions. It's a place where we can go to feel connected to the person we've lost. The article even quotes, monuments and markers provide a dedicated space where family and friends can gather to remember their loved one. They become a place where stories can be shared, tears can be shed, and love can be felt.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like having a designated spot to go to be with their memory, to reflect, and to share stories.
Exactly. And that act of visiting, of physically going to that space, can become a comforting ritual, a way to honor their memory and keep them present in our lives.
It's interesting that you mention rituals because the article also talks about how the process of choosing a memorial itself can be incredibly healing.
It absolutely can be. The act of creating something tangible, something that represents your loved one's life and legacy, can be a powerful way to channel your grief into something positive and lasting. The article mentions grief can feel overwhelming, and having a physical place to channel that emotion can be incredibly healing. Monuments and markers give us a focal point for our love, sadness, and gratitude.
It's like taking all those complicated emotions and focusing them on creating something beautiful and meaningful.
Precisely. And in doing so, you're not only honoring their memory, but you're also creating a space for future generations to connect with their legacy. The article really emphasizes the role of memorials in bridging the past and the present.
So these physical markers become more than just about remembering someone who's passed. They become a way to keep their story alive for future generations.
Exactly. It's like saying to the world, this person mattered, their story is worth remembering. And by creating a physical representation of their life, you're ensuring that their legacy lives on even as time passes.
Okay, so we've talked about memorials as places of remembrance and tools for healing, but the article also talks about them as symbols of legacy and love. What does that mean beyond just remembering someone?
It's about encapsulating the essence of who they were, their passions, their values, their unique spirit. It's about creating a testament to a life well lived.
Like with my dad in the lighthouse. It wasn't just about marking his grave, it was about capturing his love for the sea, his adventurous spirit.
Exactly. And that's what makes each memorial so special and unique. It's a reflection of the individual it represents.
That brings up another point. The article emphasizes the importance of personalization. It says there is no right or wrong way to do it. It's all about finding something that feels right for you and your family.
Absolutely. And it can be a beautiful way to involve family members in the grieving process, sharing memories, brainstorming ideas, even debating details. It can be a cathartic experience that brings everyone together.
It's like a collaborative art project where the end result is a beautiful tribute to your loved one. I know when we were choosing the headstone for my dad, we all had different ideas, but ultimately we came up with something that felt perfect.
And that's the beauty of it. It's a very personal and creative process. You can choose something traditional or something completely unique.
So it's not just about choosing between a headstone or a bench. You could create a memorial garden, dedicate a park bench, or even plant a tree in their honor.
Exactly. The possibilities are endless. You can think outside the box and come up with something truly special that reflects their personality and passions.
I remember seeing a memorial garden once that was dedicated to a woman who was a passionate gardener. It was filled with her favorite flowers and plants. It was so beautiful and fitting.
That's a perfect example. It's a way to take a piece of their personality and make it a permanent part of the landscape.
And it's fascinating. The article touches on how these memorials can actually help us navigate the grieving process. It's not just about remembering, it's about finding a way to move forward.
That's a really important point. The article talks about how grief can feel so overwhelming, but having a physical place to channel those emotions can be incredibly helpful. It provides a focal point for our love, sadness, and gratitude. It's like having a designated space to process those feelings.
It's like you're giving yourself permission to grieve, to remember to celebrate their life.
Exactly. And by creating a physical marker, you're not trying to erase the pain of their absence, but rather you're finding a way to honor their memory and keep their spirit alive.
And in doing so, you're creating a lasting tribute that can bring comfort and solace for years to come.
It's about finding a way to incorporate their memory into our lives in a healthy and positive way.
And that's something we can all learn from.
Hmm.
So as we move forward in this conversation, I'm curious to explore how those rituals we create around these memorials can evolve over time as we move through the grieving process.
I think that's a great point. And it leads us into a deeper understanding of how these physical markers can become anchors for our healing journey.
Okay, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
How do these rituals evolve and what makes them so powerful?
Well, think about the act of visiting a gravesite, for example. It often becomes a ritualistic practice. Maybe you bring flowers, share stories, or just sit in quiet contemplation.
Right. For some, it's a weekly visit. For others, it's on birthdays or anniversaries.
Exactly. And those rituals, combined with the physical presence of the memorial, create a tangible connection to the deceased, even though they are no longer physically with us.
It's like keeping their memory alive in a very real and tangible way.
And what's fascinating here is that these rituals can evolve over time. As we move through the grieving process, the way we interact with the memorial might change as well.
That makes sense. In the early stages of grief, those visits might be filled with intense sadness and longing. But as time passes, those visits might take on a different tone.
Absolutely. There might still be sadness, but there might also be a sense of peace, even joy in remembering the person and the life they lived.
It becomes less about the rawness of the loss and more about celebrating the life that was lived.
Beautifully put. And it highlights how these memorials and the rituals we create around them can be powerful tools for navigating the complexities of grief and finding our way to healing.
It's almost like those rituals help us to redefine our relationship with the person we've lost. The sharp edges of grief soften, and we find new ways to connect and remember.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And it brings up another interesting point about the evolving nature of these rituals. They can also become a way to pass on memories and stories to future generations who may not have known the person directly.
So it's not just about our personal connection to the deceased, but also about ensuring that their story continues to be told.
Precisely. Think about family gatherings at a gravesite. Younger generations might hear stories they've never heard before, see photos, and gain a deeper understanding of their family history.
It becomes a living history lesson passed down through generations.
Exactly. And it helps to keep the memory of that person alive in a way that goes beyond just a name on a headstone.
And it ties back to that idea of memorials being symbols of legacy and love, right? It's about ensuring that the person's spirit lives on not just in stone or bronze, but in the hearts and minds of the people who love them.
Absolutely. And it speaks to the power of storytelling. When we share stories about our loved ones, we're keeping their memory alive in a very real and tangible way.
It's like weaving a tapestry of their life, with each story adding a new thread, a new dimension.
I love that analogy. And it highlights the importance of not just creating a physical memorial, but also actively keeping their memory alive in our daily lives.
What do you mean by that? How can we do that in a way that feels authentic and meaningful?
It could be as simple as cooking their favorite meal, telling stories about them to younger generations, or even just taking a moment each day to reflect on the impact they had on our lives.
Those are great suggestions. It's about finding ways to incorporate their memory into our everyday lives.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be grand gestures. It's the little things, the everyday moments that can keep their spirit close.
I remember my grandmother used to make the most amazing apple pie. And every time I bake an apple pie, I think of her. It's like a little ritual that connects me to her memory.
That's a perfect example. It's about finding those personal touchstones that evoke their presence in our lives.
And it makes me think about how these memorials and rituals can evolve over time, becoming less about sadness and more about a celebration of their life.
Absolutely. As we heal and grow, our relationship with the deceased changes as well. The pain might lessen and a sense of peace might emerge. And the way we interact with their memorial might reflect that shift.
We might find ourselves smiling more at the memories, sharing funny anecdotes, or simply feeling grateful for the time we had with them.
Exactly. It's about finding a way to honor their memory in a way that feels authentic to our own healing journey.
And it brings us back to the importance of personalization. There's no right or wrong way to create a memorial or to engage in rituals. It's about finding what feels right for you.
Couldn't agree more. Whether it's a traditional headstone, a memorial bench, or a scattering of ashes in a place they loved, The most important thing is that it reflects the person's unique spirit and brings comfort to those who love them.
And it makes me wonder, as we wrap up this part of our conversation, if there are any common misconceptions about memorialization that you've encountered in your work.
That's a great question. I think one common misconception is that creating a memorial is about holding on to the past and preventing ourselves from moving on.
That's interesting. But we've been talking about how it's actually the opposite, right? It's about finding a healthy way to integrate their memory into our lives as we move forward.
Exactly. It's not about clinging to the past, but about carrying their spirit with us into the future.
So it's less about dwelling in sadness and more about finding ways to keep their love and legacy alive in our hearts and in the world.
Beautifully put. And that leads us to another misconception that there's a timeline for grieving and memorialization.
What do you mean by that?
People often feel pressure to have a memorial in place immediately after a loss, or that they need to get over their grief by a certain date. But the reality is that grief is a journey, not a destination.
So it's okay to take our time to process our emotions and to create a memorial when it feels right for us.
Absolutely.
All right.
There's no rush. And often the most meaningful memorials are the ones that are created with careful consideration and reflection.
It's about honoring the person's memory in a way that feels authentic and true to our own hearts.
And that might take time. It might involve revisiting memories, sharing stories, and gradually coming to terms with the loss.
And it makes me think about how important it is to be patient and compassionate with ourselves throughout this process.
Couldn't agree more. Grief is a journey, and we all navigate it in our own way and at our own pace.
And these memorials and the rituals we create around them can be incredibly helpful guideposts along that journey. They can be sources of comfort and connection and even inspiration as we navigate all the ups and downs of grief.
Exactly, and I think that's a really powerful message to leave our listeners with. These memorials aren't just about remembering the past, they're about carrying the love and the legacy of those we've lost into the future.
And that brings us to a question I've been pondering. The article talks about how choosing a memorial can be a deeply personal decision, and it got me thinking. If you could design a memorial for yourself, what would it be? What would you want it to say about your life and the impact you made on the world?
That's a wonderful question to consider. It really makes you think about what truly matters, doesn't it? For me, I think it would be something that encourages curiosity and exploration, perhaps a pathway leading into a forest or a telescope pointing towards the stars. What about you?
Oh, that's a tough one. But I think mine would have to involve books somehow. Maybe a cozy reading nook nestled under a giant oak tree where people could curl up with a good book and get lost in stories.
I love that. It's so fitting.
Well, as we wrap up this conversation, I'm left with a sense of hope and inspiration. Memorials in all their forms serve as powerful reminders of the love and connections that shape our lives.
They offer us a way to honor the past, embrace the present, and keep the spirit of those we've lost alive in our hearts and in the world.
And ultimately, that's what makes memorialization so meaningful. It's about finding ways to keep their memory alive, to share their stories, and to continue the legacy they left behind.
Beautifully said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our journey today.
Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights with us today. It's been a really enlightening conversation.
It's been my pleasure. And to our listeners, may you find peace and solace in remembering those you've loved and lost.